As we said in session 1, how your group ends matters. It will shape how you view the entire group experience. That's why we want to help you end well. Remember, your goal is to multiply this one group into 2 or more groups in order to create space so people who aren't currently in a group can find life-changing community. One of the best ways to end well is for your group to look back at all you've experienced together. Now, Clay Scroggins is going to talk a little bit more about that.
When you formed this group, one of the first things you did was share your stories with one another. That was hopefully part of building a strong foundation for the kind of relationships that could help you grow spiritually. That's because all of us were made by God to be attracted to story. We see the world around us through the lens of story. We see our own lives through the lens of story. Back when you were telling your stories, we told you that choosing to be in group with one another meant that your stories would come together in interesting and surprising ways. We told you that you would begin to influence the direction of other group members' stories and that they would begin to influence the direction of your story. In the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, Joshua picked up the leadership of God's people after Moses had led them out of slavery in Egypt. And after wandering in the desert for 40 years, Joshua led them to the very place where they stood on the verge of entering into the land that God had promised to them. This was a huge moment of transition and change for all of the Israelites. An entire generation of them had lived as nomadic people, wandering from place to place with their families and their livestock. Their lives hadn't exactly been stable or predictable. They had literally lived hand to mouth for their entire lives. But that was all about to change. And an obstacle that stood between the Israelites and the Promised Land was this great swollen river called the Jordan. They stood right there on the banks of the river, and they wondered how in the world they were going to ford this river or to cross this river. That then, in that very moment, God spoke to Joshua. He said, I'm going to perform a miracle in the same way I did at the Red Sea when I was delivering you from slavery in Egypt. I'm going to open up this river for God's people to walk across. I want you to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the power of God, to the front of the people. And sure enough, as they moved the Ark of the Covenant to the front and they brought it near the river, the Jordan began to pile up upon itself. It left this dry ground for Joshua and for God's people to move right through across the river and into the Promised Land. But Joshua actually said something else kind of unique. He told the people that when they got to the middle of the riverbed, one person from each of the 12 tribes was to grab a stone where the water had been, and they were to carry that stone to the night's campsite on the other side of the Jordan at a place called Gilgal. Now, why would they do this? Well, a passage earlier in Joshua, in chapter 4 actually, it tells us this. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their fathers, well, what do these stones mean? They'll tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord, your God, dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over it. The Lord, your God, did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us when we had crossed over it. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, so that you might always fear the Lord your God. You see, by commanding them to build a simple monument, Joshua gave the Israelites a story that would help them remember what God had done in their lives, as well as influence future generations. I'm assuming God didn't part any rivers during your time together as a group. You probably didn't wander in any deserts, and it's unlikely that you've built stone monuments. It's not always obvious, but God has worked in your lives. He has grown you. He has demonstrated His love for you through the people in this group. Maybe you're more generous. Sometimes that's hard to see in ourselves. Maybe you've noticed in someone else that he or she is more patient because of the people in your group. You've probably encouraged one another to take steps in your faith. You've celebrated together. Maybe, God forbid, that you've mourned together. You've challenged one another and held one another accountable for decisions you've made. You've helped one another figure out step by step what it means to follow Jesus in the context of your everyday life. You've grown since this group has began. You've changed. And that's a big deal. It's worth noting, it's worth celebrating, and it's worth remembering. You may be tempted to shortchange the celebration. It feels like a distraction maybe to look backward when you're busy working out the details of moving forward. But pausing to reflect on how God has moved in your lives, how He has used you to change one another, it's an essential reminder to the value of community in our lives. It even helps us to set up your future groups for success. And that's why this session is all about celebrating change.
By now, you've had some conversations with your leader. You've developed a game plan for how this group will end and how you'll multiply your influence by making space for others to enter into life-changing community. So for the rest of this meeting, you're going to stack stones. Figuratively speaking, of course. We've put together some resources to help you look back at your time together as a group and celebrate all of the things God has done in and through your lives. This is a time to celebrate God, this group, and one another. It's a time to celebrate change. Before I go, let me just say thank you for taking a step to join this group. Thank you for showing up, joining in, and being real week after week. Thank you for the investment you made in one another's lives. This group may be coming to an end, but you're ending it well, and your time together has made an impact on each of your lives. Your leader will take it from here.